Though there are exceptions to this rule, the opening is generally considered to be complete when your rooks are connected. And so, ignoring the fact that this is obviously an improbable position, focus on the fact that white is one move away from completing his development by castling to either side. Both moves would connect the rooks. Like all stages of a chess game, there are generally some principles and guidelines to follow as far as how to achieve your goals. And so here we've organized these principles for you to follow and try to apply in your own games. The first three rules to the opening: develop, develop, develop. Why the same rule over and over? Because it's that important. Arguably the most important piece of advice you'd ever be given is to use all of your pieces whenever you play a chess game. Development means to literally improve your position by expanding it. And both sides will typically try to develop their pieces as quickly as possible. Making some random moves here to see. Right now it's not so important where you're bringing your pieces. We're just going to try to show an example of how the pieces might be brought out into the game so that both sides might complete their development and get castled. The basic idea here is that both sides have completed their development by connecting their rooks, and they both brought out their minor pieces first, which is usually the easiest way to start fighting for control over a position. Like this dream position shows us, the rule number 4, as far as how to play the opening, is to develop your pieces toward the center. This would be an ideal example of how in a perfect world, if your opponent didn't challenge your development and your goal, you might develop your pieces to control the most important area of the board. Why is the center the most important area of the board? Let's use the knights as an example. Every piece typically does better in the center than it does on the edge of the board, but the knights in particular really highlight this principle. As we can see here, white's knight on e4 is attacking or controlling, depending on how you look at it, up to 8 territories, whereas a knight on the corner is only attacking up to 2. Though this is an extreme example, it should hopefully display for you that you would like to get every one of your pieces in the center, where they're on their ideal squares if possible. And so now you likely understand why we would refer to this as a dream development for white. Obviously, both you and your opponent will be fighting to do this so much as far as to attack the center. So achieving a dream position like that is not completely practical. Our 5th rule goes very well in conjunction with the first 4 principles you've learned, and that is to never move a piece twice, at least not before move 10. The basic idea should be obvious. If both players are trying to fight as aggressively and accurately as they can over the center, it doesn't make sense to try to battle your opponent's entire army with one piece. For example, let's focus on a queen's pawn game, which, unlike e4, is slightly more geared to control the center with the pawns. After d5 by black, usually you'll see white follow up with a move like c4, with the idea being that if black already breaks the principle of moving a piece twice, he's given up control over the center. White will then attack the center, and we've already learned the value of the center if you remember earlier in the video. So this should be clear to understand why this would be a nice opportunity for white. And after the pawn is recaptured pretty quickly, white is happy. So rather than move a piece twice, black will develop another pawn into the center, with either e6 or c6 being the most popular options, choosing to defend the center rather than to relinquish it by moving a piece twice. Principle number 6 is that both players should be able to get their kings castled, get their kings to safety by the first 10 moves of every chess game they play, if not by the first 7 moves. Most mainline openings, including the Queen's Gambit decline that I just showed you, back up to, let's say, the Ruy Lopez, an opening we've already displayed. You'll notice that even as early as move 4, white is already prepared to castle. And black, after developing his pieces, would not be too far behind from doing the same thing, perhaps defending the pawn, developing a piece, and getting castled. The main purpose of this is not to show you what is necessarily considered the best theoretical moves at the highest levels of chess, but to show you that the general principles can be followed and very good positions can be achieved before you even try to memorize opening variations. Let's talk about principle number 7, and that is in regards to the first lady of chess. Though I could likely give many examples as to why it's not the best idea to bring your queen out before the minor pieces have been developed or before you've been castled, I like to give one particularly instructive one. This example occurs when one player, the white player in this case, decides to play for the 4-move checkmate, something that many amateur beginner players do. Obviously, if your opponent misses the idea behind the queen going backdoor on the knight and checkmating the king via the weakest square f7, then white is successful. But if black plays good moves, and white continues to be stubborn in the attack of the weakest square, particularly with this mistake of g4, trying to remove the knight to achieve the goal, now we'll see why bringing the queen out so early was not the best idea. Black has the nice move d5, not only putting an attack on the bishop, but also opening up his own bishop to make a threat on g4. And after captures knight d4, queen d1, we see a position where white has moved the queen 4 times, including the attack on the queen, and a move like knight e2 would fall prey to a very famous trick of checkmate, and any other move would also leave white in a very bad position. So our final principles could probably be considered advice and practical ideas as to how you should transition into the middle game, as much as they should be considered opening ideas. For example, our 8th principle is to develop with a purpose. Essentially what that means is that all the mainline openings develop moves with a purpose. Grabbing the center, purpose to attack the pawn, purpose to defend the pawn, purpose to attack the knight who defends the pawn, that being the Ruy Lopez, which we already showed. Queen's Gambit was also an opening where you saw all the moves centered around the critical pressure of the center. Everybody was involved in either the attack or defense of these squares one way or another. Those are 2 very famous examples of openings that develop pieces with a purpose. And you should develop your pieces with purpose in your own games. The 9th principle is to watch out for your opponent's threats. We can talk about all these generalities, but the bottom line is, if you go sit down for a real game and your opponent brings the queen out early to attack the pawn, you might consider breaking the rule of moving a piece twice in order to win a large amount of material. Obviously, that's a silly example, but the point is to think about your opponent's threats beyond your own goals and principles in any position you play, whether it be the opening, middle game, or end game stage. Think about your opponent's moves and develop your pieces with a purpose. I consider principles 8 and 9 to go hand in hand in that sense, and you'll be on the right track. And finally, our 10th principle is in place, basically to remind you of all the things you've learned in this video. If you think about it, the 10th principle of connect your rooks is essentially an insurance policy. Why? Because if you're in a position to connect your rooks, whether it be by castling or completing your development with another piece, by definition, that means that you've achieved your goals of the opening. You followed all the principles of developing your minor pieces, attacking the center hopefully, bringing the queen out only when it was time, and by finally safeguarding the king and connecting the rooks, you are ready to do battle in the middle game.